You wake before the sun because there is no reason to stay asleep. The room is cold, and the air smells faintly of damp wood and old smoke. Somewhere nearby a rooster calls, not as a symbol of a new beginning, but as a reminder that work does not wait. This is what life feels like in much of medieval Europe, not in moments of crisis or war, but on an ordinary morning that will look almost identical to the one before it. When people today hear that the average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was around 30 or 40 years, it often sounds shocking, even unbelievable. But the number itself hides more than it reveals, and to understand it you have to step slowly into the rhythm of daily life as it actually was. Life expectancy in the medieval world was not a promise of how long a person would live. It was an average pulled downward by enormous numbers of deaths in early childhood. Many people did reach their 50s or even 60s, but countless others never reached their 5th birthday. Disease, poor nutrition, and simple accidents cut lives short long before old age became a concern. To understand what this meant, you must imagine a world where death was not exceptional. It was present in every household, every village, and every season. Childhood began with risk. A baby born in a medieval village faced threats from the moment of birth. Complications during labor were common, and medical knowledge was limited to experience, superstition, and tradition. Midwives did what they could, often relying on herbal remedies and prayer. Many infants did not survive their first weeks. Those who did were still vulnerable to infections, contaminated water, and malnutrition. Childhood diseases that are easily treated today could sweep through a village and take many young lives within days. For parents, grief was a familiar companion. Records show that families often lost several children before one reached adulthood. This did not mean parents loved their children less. It meant they lived with a quiet understanding that loss was always near. Some historians believe emotional bonds were weaker, but letters and burial records suggest the opposite. Grief was deep but often unspoken, folded into daily routines because there was little time or energy to dwell on it. If a child survived the early years, life did not suddenly become easy. Food was rarely abundant. Most people lived on simple diets of grain, vegetables, and occasionally small amounts of meat. Bad harvests were common, and a single poor season could mean hunger or starvation. Malnutrition weakened the body, making even small illnesses dangerous. Teeth wore down early from coarse bread, full of grit from stone mills. Infections spread easily in crowded homes where animals and people often shared the same space. Work began early. Children were expected to help as soon as they were able. This was not considered cruel or unusual. It was simply necessary. A child might tend animals, fetch water, gather firewood, or help in the fields. These tasks were physically demanding and sometimes dangerous. Accidents happened often, and without proper medical care, even a small injury could turn deadly. For those who reached adulthood, life did not suddenly become safer. The average adult faced constant physical strain. Most labor was manual, repetitive, and exhausting. Backs bent early, joints ached, and injuries healed poorly. Chronic pain was common, though rarely recorded. People accepted discomfort as part of existence, not something to be treated or solved. Disease remained a constant threat. Fevers, infections, and epidemics moved through towns with little warning. Without understanding germs or sanitation, people struggled to explain why sickness spread. Some blamed bad air, others divine punishment. Treatments ranged from herbal remedies to bloodletting, many of which offered little real help. Recovery depended largely on luck and the strength of the body. Life expectancy statistics are shaped heavily by infant mortality, but even those who reached adulthood rarely lived long by modern standards. Reaching 50 was an achievement. Reaching 60 was notable. Those who lived longer often bore the marks of hard lives etched into their bodies. Arthritis, tooth loss, poor vision, and chronic illness were common companions of old age. Yet within this harsh reality, people still formed routines, relationships, and moments of quiet satisfaction. They celebrated feast days, shared stories by firelight, and found meaning in work well done. Survival itself was an achievement, and endurance became a kind of unspoken virtue. Life was not measured in years lived, but in seasons endured. Understanding medieval life expectancy means understanding that the number alone does not tell the story. It hides the constant effort required just to remain alive. Every day was a small negotiation with hunger, illness, and exhaustion. Survival was not heroic or dramatic. It was repetitive, quiet, and uncertain. As you imagine these lives unfolding, You might begin to wonder how people understood time when the future was so fragile. Did they plan far ahead? Or did they live mostly in the present? How did this constant awareness of mortality shape their beliefs, their families, and their sense of meaning? If you lived long enough to pass through childhood, you entered a stage of life shaped not by comfort or ambition, but by endurance. Adulthood in the medieval world was not marked by celebration or personal freedom. It was marked by responsibility. Survival depended on constant work, and every adult body was expected to contribute as much as it could for as long as it could. Most people did not choose their path. Birth determined almost everything. A child born to peasants would almost certainly become a peasant. Skills were passed down quietly within families, learned through observation rather than instruction. A young boy learned how to handle tools by watching his father. A young girl learned household labor by standing beside her mother. There were no years set aside for education in the modern sense. Learning happened while working, and mistakes carried real consequences. The medieval calendar revolved around agricultural cycles. Spring meant plowing and planting. Summer brought long days of labor under the sun. Autumn was for harvesting and preparing for winter. Winter itself was a season of endurance, marked by cold, hunger, and darkness. Time was not measured in hours but in tasks and seasons. The sun determined when work began and ended. Bells, when they existed, marked prayer times rather than schedules. Food remained the central concern of daily life. Most people lived on bread made from rye or barley, thick stews of vegetables, and whatever small additions they could manage. Meat was rare for the poor, often reserved for festivals or special occasions. Protein came more often from beans or dairy when available. Hunger was not constant for everyone, but it was always close enough to be feared. One failed harvest could undo years of careful effort. Illness did not arrive dramatically. It crept in quietly, a cough that lingered, a wound that refused to heal, a fever that left someone weak and confused. Without knowledge of bacteria or viruses, people explained illness through imbalance, bad air, or divine displeasure. Treatments were based on tradition rather than evidence. Some herbs offered real relief, others did nothing, and some made conditions worse. Yet people clung to these methods because there was nothing else. Medical practitioners varied widely in skill. Some were trained in monasteries or universities, while others learned through experience alone. Surgery was crude and dangerous. Pain was accepted as unavoidable. An injury that today would be minor could end a life through infection. Many people lived with untreated injuries that limited their movement for the rest of their lives. Women faced particular risks. Pregnancy and childbirth were among the most dangerous events a woman could experience. Complications were common, and many women died young as a result. Those who survived often carried lasting physical damage. Despite this, women continued to bear children because survival of the family depended on it. Large families were not a luxury but a necessity, given how many children would not live to adulthood. Old age, when it came, was not defined by comfort or rest. There were no pensions, no retirement. An aging person worked as long as their body allowed. When strength faded, survival depended on family support or charity. Those without family might rely on the church or local goodwill, though resources were limited. Some elderly people became burdens in the eyes of their communities, a reality rarely spoken aloud but deeply felt. Yet despite hardship, people did not experience life as constant misery. They laughed, gossiped, argued, and celebrated. Festivals broke the monotony of work and gave structure to the year. Religious holidays brought communal meals, music, and a sense of shared identity. Even small pleasures, like warm bread or a successful harvest, carried deep meaning. The rhythm of medieval life created a particular relationship with time. The future was uncertain and often short. Long-term planning existed mainly in terms of survival rather than ambition. People thought in seasons, not decades. The idea of personal legacy was less about individual achievement and more about family continuity and faith. As people aged, their bodies told the story of their lives. Bent backs, scarred hands, missing teeth, and stiff joints were common. These physical signs were not hidden or treated as shameful. They were visible evidence of endurance. To grow old at all was a quiet accomplishment. Yet even as some reached old age, death remained close. Epidemics could erase decades of careful living in weeks. Famine could undo years of stability. There was no sense that progress would necessarily make life easier for the next generation. Each generation faced the same uncertainties, often with fewer resources than the last. Understanding life expectancy in this period means understanding that people lived with a constant awareness of fragility. They did not expect long lives, but they still invested meaning in the lives they had. They built families, communities, and traditions that outlasted them, even if they themselves were quickly forgotten. As you consider this, another question begins to form. If people lived with such awareness of death and limitation, how did they make sense of suffering itself? What explanations did they turn to when life felt unbearably unfair or cruel? When people in the medieval world faced suffering, they rarely asked whether life was fair. The question itself held little meaning in a time when hardship was expected rather than questioned. Instead, they asked why suffering existed at all and what it meant for the soul. Without science to explain disease or misfortune, people turned to belief, ritual, and tradition to give shape to experiences that otherwise felt unbearable. Religion provided the most powerful framework for understanding suffering. Illness, famine, and death were often interpreted as tests, punishments, or mysteries sent by a higher power. This belief did not always bring comfort, but it offered explanation where none could be found. Suffering was not random, it had purpose, even if that purpose remained hidden. Enduring hardship patiently was considered a virtue, a sign of moral strength rather than failure. This worldview shaped how people responded to pain. Complaints were often muted, not because pain was less severe, but because expressing it too openly could be seen as a lack of faith. Endurance became a quiet form of dignity. People learned to live with discomfort, to accept loss, and to continue working even when their bodies resisted. The idea of seeking happiness or fulfillment was far less important than fulfilling one's role within family and community. Community itself acted as a fragile safety net. Neighbors helped each other during illness, childbirth, or death, not out of charity in the modern sense, but because survival depended on cooperation. A village could not afford to abandon its members too easily. At the same time, help was limited, resources were scarce, and compassion had practical limits. When times grew hard enough, even close communities fractured under pressure. Death was ever present, yet it was also familiar. Bodies were washed and prepared by family members. Funerals were simple affairs, often held quickly due to the lack of preservation. Cemeteries were crowded, and graves were reused. The physical closeness of the dead reinforced the awareness that life was temporary. This did not necessarily breed despair, but it shaped a worldview in which mortality was accepted rather than denied. Children grew up watching illness and death as part of everyday life. They learned early that life was fragile. This awareness matured them quickly. Childhood innocence, as we imagine it today, was brief. Responsibility came early, and so did an understanding of loss. Yet this did not erase joy. Laughter, play, and affection existed alongside sorrow, not in opposition to it. Over time, the accumulation of these experiences formed a collective mindset. People did not expect progress in the modern sense. They did not assume life would get easier for their children. Improvement, when it came, was slow and often invisible. Stability itself was considered a success. Simply surviving without disaster was an achievement worth gratitude. This perspective shaped how people viewed aging and death. Old age was not something to be feared or avoided. It was a rare privilege. Those who reached it often carried deep respect within their communities, not because of wealth or power, but because they had endured. Their bodies told stories that words could not. Every scar, every ache, every missing tooth was evidence of persistence. Looking back, it is tempting to judge these lives as harsh or incomplete, yet to do so misses an important truth. Meaning was not found in comfort or longevity, but in continuity. Each generation passed on knowledge, habits, and values, even when material progress was minimal. The fact that people continued to build families, work fields, and care for one another under such conditions speaks to a quiet resilience that shaped the future more than any single event. The modern world often measures success in years lived, comfort achieved, and freedom enjoyed. The medieval world measured it differently. Survival itself was an accomplishment. Endurance was a form of wisdom. And life, though brief and uncertain, was still filled with routines, relationships, and moments of calm that gave it shape. As you step back from this world of short lives and long struggles, it becomes clear that history is not only shaped by kings, wars, and grand events. It is shaped by countless ordinary people who woke each day, did what they could, and faced uncertainty with quiet resolve. And as you consider how much has changed since then, one question remains quietly in the background. If life today feels long and complex, how much of our own sense of meaning still depends on the same simple human need to endure, adapt, and continue forward. You wake to the smell of smoke long before you see light. It seeps through the room, clinging to clothes, hair, and skin. The fire never truly goes out, because restarting it is difficult and costly. Instead, it smolders through the night, filling the house with a haze that stings the eyes and settles deep in the lungs. This is not a special morning. It is simply how most people in the medieval world began their day. Homes were not designed for comfort. They were built for survival, using whatever materials were available nearby. Wood, mud, straw, and stone formed walls that barely kept out the cold. Windows were small or non-existent, sometimes covered with cloth or animal hide instead of glass. Light came from the hearth, or from narrow doorways, and darkness dominated most hours of the day. Smoke from cooking fires lingered inside, coating ceilings and lungs alike. The hearth was the center of the home. It provided heat, light, and a place to cook. It was also a source of danger. Sparks could ignite dry straw roofs, and many villages burned repeatedly over the centuries. Still, without fire, life would have been nearly impossible. It dried clothes, warmed food, and offered some protection from dampness and cold. People learned to live with the discomfort it caused, because there was no alternative. Cold was a constant presence, even in warmer seasons. Medieval houses retained little heat. Winter brought frozen floors, numb fingers, and breath visible indoors. People slept fully clothed, often several to a bed, sharing warmth. Animals might be brought inside during harsh weather, adding body heat, but also noise and filth. Comfort, as we understand it today, did not exist. Warmth was something you earned through effort and endured through patience. Food preparation dominated daily life. Bread was the foundation of nearly every meal, but it was not the soft white bread familiar today. It was dense, dark, and often gritty from stone-ground flour. Baking required access to a communal oven or a carefully tended hearth. Bread went stale quickly and was often soaked or reheated to make it edible. Every crumb mattered. Waste was unthinkable. The air inside these homes was thick with smells. Smoke, sweat, damp wool, and cooked grains mixed together constantly. Bathing was infrequent, not because people disliked cleanliness, but because heating water was difficult and time-consuming. Cleanliness was more about managing dirt than eliminating it. Clothes were worn for long periods and rarely washed. The concept of personal hygiene was different, shaped by what was realistically possible. Illness thrived in these conditions. Respiratory problems were common due to constant smoke inhalation. Eyes watered and burned. Coughs lingered for years. Yet, these symptoms were so widespread that they were considered normal. People did not describe themselves as sick unless they were completely unable to work. Discomfort was simply part of life. The home was also a workspace. Spinning, weaving, mending, and food preparation all happened in the same small area. Privacy barely existed. Several generations often lived together, sharing space and noise. Children grew up observing every aspect of adult life, from labor to illness to death. There was little separation between private and public existence. Despite this, homes were places of routine and familiarity. The arrangement of objects, the rhythm of chores, and the repetition of daily tasks created a sense of order. People took comfort in knowing where everything belonged and what needed to be done next. Stability did not come from comfort, but from repetition. Weather played a powerful role in shaping daily life. A cold winter could mean hunger. A wet summer could ruin crops. Homes offered limited protection against these forces. Rain found its way through roofs. Wind crept through cracks in walls. People adapted by layering clothing, repairing damage as best they could, and enduring what they could not fix. Light was precious. Candles were expensive and often reserved for special occasions. Most evenings were spent in near darkness, with work done by firelight if at all. This limited how long people stayed awake. Sleep followed the natural rhythm of the sun, rather than a clock. Night was a time of rest, but also vulnerability. Despite all of this, people formed deep attachments to their homes. These structures represented stability in an uncertain world. They were places where births, deaths, meals, and memories unfolded. Even when homes were cold, smoky, and cramped, they were still anchors in a life defined by constant effort. As you imagine these spaces, it becomes clear that daily survival was shaped not by dramatic events, but by small, repeated struggles against cold, hunger, and exhaustion. These were the conditions under which communities formed, relationships grew, and traditions took root. And yet, beyond the walls of these homes, another force shaped daily life, just as powerfully as hunger or cold. The work that waited outside each morning would determine whether survival was possible at all. When the door opened and the morning air rushed in, work began immediately. For most people in the medieval world, labor was not something that filled part of the day. It was the day, survival depended on it, and there was no clear boundary between work and life. Every movement had purpose, every task tied to the simple goal of getting through another season. The majority of people lived from the land, even if they did not own it. Fields had to be plowed, planted, weeded, and harvested in a precise rhythm dictated by weather and daylight. Tools were heavy and simple, often made of wood with iron edges that required constant repair. Plowing with an ox or horse demanded strength and coordination. A mistake could mean a broken tool or an injured animal, either of which could threaten the entire year's food supply. The labor did not stop when the crops were planted. Weeds had to be pulled by hand. Fences needed mending. Grain had to be protected from birds, animals, and theft. When harvest time arrived, the work intensified. Entire communities labored from dawn until dark, racing against weather and decay. The harvest was not just hard work, it was a test of endurance. Every sheaf of grain represented survival through the coming winter. For those who lived in towns, work took different forms, but was no less demanding. Craftspeople worked long hours at looms, anvils, or workbenches. Bakers rose long before dawn. Tanners labored in foul conditions, soaking hides in urine and lime. Blacksmiths endured heat and smoke, hammering metal until their arms ached. Each trade came with its own dangers and long-term damage to the body. There were no safety standards. Injuries were common and often permanent. A crushed finger, a damaged eye, or a deep cut could end a livelihood. Without insurance or social protection, injury meant dependence on family or charity. Many people continued working through pain because they had no other choice. Rest was a luxury few could afford. Children joined the workforce early. By the age of 7 or 8, most were expected to contribute in some way. They fetched water, tended animals, carried messages, or helped in workshops. This was not seen as exploitation, but as preparation for adult life. Learning through labor was how knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Time itself felt different. There were no precise clocks for most people. Bells from churches marked prayer times and loosely divided the day. Seasonal changes mattered more than hours. Summer meant long days of labor. Winter brought shorter days and slightly slower routines, though work never fully stopped. People lived according to natural cycles rather than strict schedules. Despite the exhaustion, work also provided structure and identity. A person was known by their labor. Names were often tied to professions, and pride was taken in skill and reliability. A good craftsman, or diligent worker, earned respect, even if wealth remained out of reach. Reputation mattered deeply in small communities where everyone depended on one another. Yet work could also be isolating. Long hours left little time for reflection or leisure. Social life often revolved around work itself, with conversations taking place while hands remained busy. Moments of rest were brief and valued. A shared drink, a song, or a story told by the fire offered temporary relief from physical strain. Weather remained an unpredictable enemy. A single storm could undo weeks of effort. Floods ruined crops. Drought dried fields into dust. Cold snaps killed livestock. People had limited ability to prepare for these events, relying instead on hope, prayer, and experience. When disaster struck, it was often seen as fate, rather than misfortune. Over time, the accumulation of labor shaped bodies and minds. Backs bent, joints stiffened, and hands hardened. These physical changes were accepted as natural signs of a life well worked. There was pride in visible endurance, even as pain became constant. To stop working entirely was often to invite hunger or social decline. Despite the hardship, work created bonds. Neighbors depended on one another during harvests or emergencies. Shared labor built trust and obligation. These networks of mutual aid were fragile but essential. When they failed, survival became uncertain. As the day ended, people returned to their homes tired and marked by labor. Yet the next day would bring the same demands. Work was not something to escape from, but something to endure, repeat, and accept as the shape of life itself. As you consider this relentless cycle of labor, another question quietly emerges. If so much of life was consumed by work and survival, what space remained for joy, belief, or meaning beyond endurance itself? When the day's work finally ended and the tools were set aside, what remained was not rest in the modern sense, but a softer kind of pause. The body was exhausted, yet the mind still moved through familiar rhythms. Evening was not a time for leisure, as we understand it today, but it was a moment when effort briefly loosened its grip. In those hours, people found small pockets of meaning that helped them endure lives shaped by repetition and strain. As darkness settled, families gathered close to the hearth. The fire was dim, often more smoke than flame, but it was enough to draw people together. This closeness mattered. It was during these quiet hours that stories were told, not as entertainment alone, but as memory, instruction, and comfort. Stories passed down lessons, explained the world, and reminded listeners that others before them had endured the same hardships. Songs were common, not performed for audiences, but shared among those who knew them by heart. The melodies were simple, shaped by repetition rather than artistry. Many songs told of work, loss, love, or faith. They were sung softly, sometimes almost absent-mindedly, as if to fill the silence rather than perform. Music did not require instruments. Voices were enough. Faith played a steady role in these moments. Prayer was woven into daily life rather than set apart. It marked the beginning and end of the day, accompanied meals, and offered structure when understanding failed. Faith did not always bring comfort, but it offered explanation. It gave suffering a place within a larger order, making hardship feel less random, even if no less painful. Community gatherings broke the routine from time to time. Feast days, religious festivals, and seasonal celebrations created brief spaces where work paused. Food was shared more generously. Laughter came more easily. These moments did not erase hardship, but they reminded people that life held more than labor alone. Even small celebrations carried deep meaning because they were rare. Yet even in these moments of rest, the awareness of tomorrow never fully disappeared. The fields would still need tending, the animals would still need care. Illness or bad weather could undo months of effort. People learned to enjoy what they could without expecting it to last. Joy was not something to be chased. It was something noticed when it appeared. Aging brought a different kind of rhythm. Those who lived long enough to slow down often became quiet observers of the world they once worked so hard to maintain. Their value shifted from physical labor to memory and advice. They remembered years of good harvests and years of hunger, passing down knowledge that could not be learned from tools alone. Their presence linked past and present in ways that work alone could not. Despite the hardships, there was a sense of belonging that came from shared endurance. Life was difficult, but it was rarely faced alone. Neighbors relied on one another, not out of idealism, but necessity. This reliance shaped communities into tight, sometimes unforgiving networks, where everyone's survival was connected. When you step back and look at these lives, it becomes clear that meaning did not come from comfort or progress. It came from continuity, from waking each day and doing what needed to be done, from knowing that others had done the same before, and others would follow. The homes were cold, the work was heavy, and the future was uncertain. Yet within these limits, people found ways to live, connect, and endure. Their world was smaller, harsher, and more fragile than ours, but it was also deeply rooted in shared experience. As this story closes, one quiet question remains. If so much of life was shaped by necessity rather than choice, what truly gave these people a sense of purpose beyond survival itself? If you managed to survive childhood, endure years of labor, and avoid the many dangers of daily life, you might reach an age that others quietly respected. Old age in the medieval world was not defined by a number, it was defined by visible change. A person was considered old when their strength faded, when their pace slowed, and when the body no longer recovered as it once had. There was no clear line between adulthood and old age, only a gradual wearing down. Growing old without medicine meant living with constant discomfort. Pain was not an event, but a condition. Joints stiffened from decades of work, backs curved from years of bending and lifting, teeth wore away or fell out, making eating difficult and sometimes painful. Vision blurred, hearing faded, and balance became uncertain. These changes were accepted as natural, not as problems to be solved. There were no treatments for aging itself. What care existed focused on easing symptoms rather than curing causes. Herbal remedies were common, passed down through generations. Some herbs offered real relief. Others did little more than provide comfort through belief. Warm compresses, poultices and rest were common responses to pain. Surgery was rare and dangerous, especially for the elderly, whose bodies healed slowly and poorly. Old age often brought a shift in role, rather than a complete withdrawal from work. Those who could no longer perform heavy labor took on lighter tasks. They watched children, mended tools, sorted grain, or shared knowledge. Their value was no longer measured by strength, but by experience. In a world where information was passed orally, memory itself was a form of wealth. Yet growing old also meant increasing dependence. When strength faded too much, survival depended on family or community support. There were no pensions, no guaranteed care. Some elderly people were cared for by children or extended family. Others relied on charity or the church. Those without support faced severe hardship. Poverty in old age was common and deeply feared. The emotional experience of aging was shaped by these realities. Fear of becoming a burden weighed heavily on many. Some elderly people worked beyond their limits to avoid relying on others. Others withdrew quietly, aware that their presence strained limited resources. Dignity was tied closely to usefulness, and losing that usefulness could be painful. Despite this, old age also carried a certain respect. Elders were often seen as living records of the past. They remembered events that shaped the community and passed down knowledge about farming, weather patterns, and survival strategies. Their stories connected generations and preserved collective memory in a world without books for most people. Illness in old age was often accepted as inevitable. When death approached, it was rarely hidden. Family members gathered, prayers were said, and preparations were made. Death was not a medical event, but a social and spiritual one. People expected to die at home, surrounded by familiar faces. There was little illusion of control over the end of life. Acceptance, rather than resistance, shaped the final years. This acceptance did not mean a lack of fear or sadness, but it reflected a worldview in which death was woven into daily existence. To grow old was to come closer to something everyone expected. Yet even in decline, life retained meaning. Older people continued to observe the world around them, to care in small ways, to remember. Their presence reminded others of time's passage and the endurance required to reach such an age. As you consider these lives shaped by endurance rather than comfort, another question emerges. How did people prepare for death in a world where it was always near? And what rituals helped them face the end with some sense of peace? As the body weakened and the signs of age became impossible to ignore, thoughts turned more often toward death. In the medieval world, preparing for death was not something postponed until the final days. It was an ongoing awareness that shaped behavior, belief, and routine long before the body began to fail. Death was not a distant abstraction. It was a presence woven into daily life, visible in illness, accidents, and the steady passing of neighbors and kin. Preparation for death was as much spiritual as practical. People believed that dying well mattered deeply, not only for the individual but for the community left behind. A good death meant being conscious, reconciled with others, and spiritually prepared. Confession, prayer, and forgiveness were essential steps. The fear was not death itself, but dying unprepared, without having set things right. As age advanced, individuals often began to make quiet arrangements. Possessions, few as they were distributed carefully. A cooking pot, a blanket, a tool, or a small piece of land might be promised to a child or neighbor. These objects carried emotional weight far beyond their material value. They represented continuity, memory, and gratitude. The home became the center of the final stage of life. There were no hospitals in the modern sense for most people. Illness and dying happened in the same spaces where people had lived, worked, and raised families. Beds were shared or moved close to the hearth. Family members and neighbors gathered to offer care, prayer, and companionship. The role of the community at the end of life cannot be overstated. People took turns sitting with the dying, offering water, holding hands, or simply being present. Silence was common, but it was not empty. It carried recognition, acceptance, and respect. Death was not hidden away. It was faced together. Religious rituals gave structure to this moment. Prayers were spoken to prepare the soul. Priests or local religious figures were called when possible to offer final rites. These rituals were believed to ease the passage from life to whatever came next. For those who believed in divine judgment, they offered reassurance. For others, they provided a sense of order in an uncertain moment. Grief began before death itself. Family members often mourned in advance, aware that time was limited. Yet this anticipation also allowed for farewells, expressions of forgiveness, and moments of tenderness that might otherwise have been left unsaid. In this way, death was both an ending and a closing of unfinished emotional threads. After death, the body was washed and prepared by family or community members. There was little separation between the living and the dead. Children often witnessed these preparations, learning early that death was a natural part of life's cycle. The body was then buried, usually quickly, in simple graves close to the community or church. Grieving continued long after burial, but it was not private in the modern sense. Mourning was shared, woven into daily routines. People returned to work, but grief lingered in quiet ways. There were few formal expectations about how long one should mourn. Sorrow was personal, shaped by circumstance rather than rule. For the elderly, witnessing the deaths of friends, spouses, and children was common. Loneliness was a real and heavy burden. Yet many also found a strange clarity in old age. With fewer responsibilities and less expectation of the future, some focused on reflection, prayer, or simply observing the world around them. The acceptance of death did not mean the absence of fear. It meant living with that fear in a way that allowed life to continue. People learned to balance awareness of mortality with the need to keep going, to find meaning in daily routines, and to value the time they still had. As you reflect on how deeply death shaped the rhythm of medieval life, another question begins to emerge. If people lived so close to death, how did they understand life itself, and what values did they pass on to those who followed? When people in the medieval world thought about life, they did not separate it neatly from death. The two existed side by side, shaping each other in quiet, constant ways. Life was not imagined as a long journey toward personal fulfillment, but as a temporary state filled with obligations, relationships, and responsibilities that had to be honored while time allowed. Meaning came less from individual ambition, and more from continuity, from knowing one's place within a long human chain. The lessons passed from one generation to the next were practical above all else. Children learned how to survive, how to work, and how to endure, but they also absorbed values that shaped how they understood existence itself. Patience was admired, endurance was respected, acceptance was often praised more than ambition. These were not ideals chosen freely, but adaptations to a world where control over one's circumstances was limited. Elders played a central role in preserving these values. Through stories, habits, and quiet example, they showed younger people how to live within constraint. They spoke of years of scarcity and of seasons when survival seemed uncertain. These stories were not told for drama but for instruction. They reminded listeners that hardship was neither new nor unusual, and that others had endured it before. Faith, whether deeply personal or loosely practiced, offered a framework for understanding suffering. Life was seen as a test, a preparation, or a temporary passage. This belief did not erase pain, but it gave it context. In a world where fairness was rarely visible, faith helped people accept outcomes they could not change. Yet meaning was not found only in belief or endurance. It also emerged from connection. Family bonds, shared labor, and communal rituals created a sense of belonging that softened the weight of daily struggle. Even in poverty, people found identity through relationships. To be known, remembered, and needed gave life purpose beyond survival. As generations passed, these values shaped entire communities. They influenced how people treated one another, how they responded to crisis, and how they measured a life well lived. Success was not defined by wealth or achievement, but by steadiness, reliability, and contribution. A good life was one in which a person fulfilled their role, cared for others when possible, and met hardship without losing their sense of self. Looking back, it is easy to see medieval life as harsh and limited. Yet within those limits existed a kind of clarity. People understood what was expected of them, and what they could reasonably hope for. They did not chase endless improvement or personal reinvention. Instead, they focused on continuity, endurance, and the quiet dignity of persistence. This worldview shaped centuries of human experience. It influenced how communities formed, how traditions survived, and how knowledge was passed on. Even as the world slowly changed, these deeply rooted attitudes continued to shape how people understood life and death. As this story draws to a close, one final question remains. If meaning once came from endurance and shared responsibility, what have we gained, and what might we have lost? As our understanding of life has shifted toward comfort, choice, and individual freedom. To be born into the medieval world was to enter a life already shaped by expectation. Childhood, as we understand it today, did not exist as a protected or separate stage. Instead, it was a brief transition between infancy and usefulness. From the moment a child could walk, they were slowly drawn into the rhythm of work that defined their family's survival. There were no clear boundaries between play and labor. A child might chase a chicken through the yard one moment and be expected to help feed it the next. Toys were rare, often improvised from scraps of wood, cloth, or bone. Play often mimicked adult tasks, not out of imagination alone, but because children learned by watching and copying what they saw every day. In this way, work began early and felt natural rather than imposed. Education, in the modern sense, was limited to a small portion of the population. Most children never learned to read or write. Knowledge was practical, passed down through demonstration and repetition. A child learned to plant seeds by watching hands move through soil. They learned to spin wool by sitting beside someone older, copying each motion. Mistakes were corrected, not with instruction manuals, but with patience or sometimes frustration. Childhood was also marked by physical vulnerability. Illness spread easily among the young, and many children did not survive their early years. Those who did often carried the marks of early hardship. Malnutrition could stunt growth. Injuries healed poorly. Yet these realities were accepted as part of life, not as failures of care. Parents grieved deeply, but they also understood the limits of what could be done. From an early age, children were expected to contribute meaningfully. By the age of 7 or 8, many were already performing regular tasks. They fetched water, watched younger siblings, gathered fuel, or helped in fields and workshops. Their labor mattered. A child who could carry a bucket or tend a fire made a real difference in a household where every small effort counted. There was little room for idleness. Time not spent working was often filled with observation or instruction. Older children learned skills that would define their adult lives. Boys were trained in the trades of their fathers. Girls were taught domestic tasks that would prepare them for marriage and household management. These roles were not framed as limitations but as necessities shaped by survival. Despite the demands placed on them, children were not entirely without joy. They found moments of laughter in games, songs, and shared mischief. These moments were brief, but meaningful. Play often took place in the margins of work, not apart from it. A game might begin while watching animals, or during a pause in chores, then fade as responsibilities resumed. Discipline was firm, sometimes harsh by modern standards. Obedience was valued because it ensured safety and order. A child who ignored instructions could cause real harm, not just inconvenience. As a result, expectations were clear, and consequences were immediate. Yet discipline also came with guidance, as adults understood that children needed to be shaped rather than simply controlled. As children grew older, the line between childhood and adulthood blurred further. Adolescence, as we define it today, did not truly exist. By the time a young person reached their early teens, they were often working nearly full-time. Responsibilities expanded quickly, and with them came the weight of adult expectations. Childhood in this world was brief, demanding, and shaped by necessity, yet it was not without meaning. Within its limits, children formed bonds, learned skills, and developed a sense of belonging that would carry them into adult life. As you consider these early years, another question naturally arises. How did these children transition from learning through imitation to carrying the full responsibilities of adulthood, and what marked that change in a world without clear milestones? As childhood progressed, the transition into adulthood became less a moment, and more a gradual accumulation of responsibility. By their early teens, most young people were already performing work that would sustain a household or contribute to the family's livelihood. In many ways, survival dictated the pace of maturation. There was little leisure, and the skills necessary for life could not wait. Every task, no matter how small, was a step toward becoming a fully contributing member of society. Boys followed the patterns of their fathers and male relatives. Fields, livestock, carpentry, blacksmithing, and other trades were learned through repetition and observation. Mistakes were corrected immediately, because errors carried real consequences. A poorly tended crop, a mismanaged animal, or a damaged tool could threaten the family's survival. Instruction was rarely verbal alone. Learning by watching, imitating, and doing was the norm. Guidance was a mixture of demonstration, correction, and the implicit lessons of cause and effect. Girls, meanwhile, were trained in domestic labor. Cooking, spinning, weaving, sewing, and the management of household resources became their daily curriculum. From an early age, Girls learned to balance multiple tasks simultaneously, preparing meals while tending to younger siblings, mending clothes while watching over firewood. This multitasking was not a skill taught formally, but absorbed through constant repetition. The work itself shaped focus, patience, and endurance. Like boys, girls' labor was essential, and mistakes could carry consequences for the entire household. Despite the ever-present demands, adolescence also allowed for social development within structured limits. Seasonal gatherings, church services, and village events provided opportunities to observe adult interactions. Festivals offered moments to practice negotiation, exchange, and cooperation on a larger scale than the household alone. Even as children worked alongside adults, they gradually learned the rules of social behavior, hierarchy, and expectation that would govern their adult lives. Education for most remained practical and experiential. Reading and writing were largely privileges of the wealthy or religious communities. For the majority, knowledge was oral, tacit, and intimately tied to survival. Stories, proverbs, and local lore served as a guide for understanding the world. These narratives were not only entertainment, they transmitted moral lessons, agricultural wisdom, and collective memory, ensuring continuity of culture even without formal schooling. Work itself taught resilience. Long hours, unpredictable outcomes, and repeated failure were part of daily experience. Young people developed stamina, both physical and mental, by necessity. Pain, fatigue, and disappointment were not unusual. They were expected and accepted. The capacity to endure became as important as any technical skill, shaping temperament and perspective in ways that formal instruction could not. Health risks continued to shape adolescence. Disease, injury, and malnutrition were never far away. Simple accidents could escalate without treatment. Fever, infection, and chronic conditions left scars both physical and psychological. Those who survived early adolescence developed not only strength, but a keen awareness of fragility. The experience of danger became routine, reinforcing the value of caution, observation, and adaptation. Relationships deepened during this stage of life. Friendships often formed around shared labor, with peers learning cooperation and loyalty through shared responsibility. Bonds forged in work environments were practical, but they were also social anchors. Young people learned to negotiate, trust, and support one another, skills that would serve them in adult households, villages, and communities. By the time a teenager reached the mid-teens, the distinction between child and adult had largely dissolved. They were expected to perform as adults in all meaningful ways. Work, care, and social contribution were no longer optional. Decisions carried weight. Their actions affected others' survival. The brevity of childhood and the early onset of adult responsibility defined the rhythm of life and created a profound understanding of interdependence. Yet, within this structured, labor-intensive world, moments of reflection and small joys persisted. A quiet sunset over fields, a shared meal, a story told by firelight, these were glimpses of life beyond mere survival. They reminded young people that even in a world dominated by work and necessity, there were fragments of beauty and connection to notice and cherish. As you contemplate the progression from childhood into adolescence in the medieval world, one question lingers. How did the early imposition of responsibility shape identity, ambition, and the sense of self in a society where survival often outweighed personal desire? By the time a young person reached the age of 16 or 17, the transition into adulthood was effectively complete. Childhood, which might have seemed long to those living in comfort today, had already been brief and filled with practical education. The new adult was now expected to carry full responsibility, contribute to the family, and participate fully in the community. Independence was real, but it came with almost no margin for error. Survival demanded competence, endurance, and social awareness. For boys, adulthood meant mastery over the physical and technical skills that had been gradually learned. They were expected to work alongside fathers, craftsmen, or village elders, producing goods, tending animals, or managing land. Competence was measured by results, not by age or experience alone. Those who could not perform were quickly marginalized, or at the very least, reminded of their limitations. Success was practical. Did one's labor sustain the household or improve the community? That was the measure of worth. Girls, similarly, assumed full responsibility for domestic labor, child-rearing, and the maintenance of household resources. Marriage, often arranged or strategically advantageous, could arrive shortly after adolescence. With it came the additional responsibilities of managing a household, producing food, caring for children, and navigating social obligations. The transition from learning to doing was immediate, and there was little time to pause or reconsider. Every decision had consequences for survival, health, or social stability. Health remained precarious. Adolescents entering adulthood carried the accumulated effects of childhood nutrition, minor injuries, and illnesses. Those who survived this far were often resilient, but their bodies were already shaped by years of labor. Life was physically demanding, and the risk of chronic pain, infection, and fatigue was ever present. Yet, there was also an understanding that resilience itself had value. Enduring hardship was not merely a necessity, it was a mark of character and capability. Social roles solidified during these years. Reputation mattered more than abstract notions of personal identity. Reliability, skill, and contribution defined social standing. Relationships were structured by interdependence. Neighbors, relatives, and the broader community all had expectations, and fulfilling them was crucial. Personal desires were secondary to obligations, though they were not entirely absent. Adolescence had provided glimpses of social and emotional life, but adulthood demanded prioritization of the collective over the individual. Even with responsibilities weighing heavily, life contained moments of human connection and meaning. Work could be collaborative, laughter shared over small successes or misadventures. Religious practice offered solace and order. Seasonal events, fairs and festivals provided brief reprieves from the unrelenting rhythm of survival. These moments were fleeting but deeply valued because they offered contrast to the everyday struggle. The psychological transition from child to adult was less about ceremony and more about accumulated experience. Each day of labor, each responsibility fulfilled, each moment of endurance contributed to a sense of identity rooted in capability, reliability, and belonging. Young people learned to measure themselves against the demands of reality rather than abstract ideals, a perspective that shaped their understanding of life for decades to come. Reflecting on this progression, it becomes clear that medieval childhood was a period of preparation in the most practical sense. It forged endurance, skill, and social awareness, shaping individuals capable of sustaining households, communities, and traditions. Childhood may have been brief and demanding, but it was essential to the continuity of society. And yet, one final question arises. In a world where adulthood arrived so early and personal freedom was constrained by necessity, how did individuals find moments of self-expression, hope, or ambition? And how did these moments shape the course of their lives within such rigid structures? Imagine waking before sunrise to the chill of damp air, your breath visible as it rises in front of you. Outside, the fields await, stretching unevenly across hills, marshes, and pastures. For most people in the medieval world, life revolved around agriculture. Survival depended on the soil, the weather, and the ability to work tirelessly from dawn until dusk. Farming was not an occupation, but a way of life, and every day carried the pressure of sustaining oneself and one's family. The work began with preparation. Fields were ploughed using wooden ploughs reinforced with iron, often pulled by oxen or horses. The plough was heavy, and the soil resistant. Each furrow required strength, technique, and endurance. Mistakes could destroy the year's crop before it had even begun. Ploughing was not just physical labor, it required knowledge of the land, the seasons, and the behavior of animals. Skillful ploughing could make the difference between scarcity and relative security. Planting followed. Seeds were sown by hand, scattered across the furrows, and then gently pressed into the soil. Timing was critical. Plant too early, and frost might destroy the young shoots. Plant too late, and the crop might fail to mature before the first autumn frosts. People relied on experience, observation, and the counsel of elders to determine when and how to plant. Knowledge accumulated over decades, often passed down orally rather than written, became the backbone of survival. Maintenance of the crops demanded constant attention. Weeds threatened to choke seedlings, pests ate leaves or roots, and unpredictable weather could undo careful work. Villagers often worked together during critical periods, sharing labor in exchange for reciprocal help. While work was exhausting, cooperation created social bonds, reinforcing the interdependence of small communities. Even so, the pressure to maintain productivity never fully relaxed. Failure meant hunger, debt, or both. Harvest was the most crucial and stressful time. Fields required long hours, often from dawn to dusk, with every hand contributing to cutting, bundling, and transporting the crop. Timing was essential. Delay could result in rotting grain or missed opportunities to store food for the winter. Entire families participated, with children carrying smaller bundles and older members performing the heaviest work. Precision, speed, and endurance defined success. Storage and preservation presented another challenge. Granaries, barns, and storage pits were constructed to protect grain from moisture, rodents, and theft. Techniques were imperfect, and losses were common. People learned through trial and error, developing methods such as elevated platforms, drying, and layered storage to extend the life of essential food. Survival depended not only on the quality of the harvest, but also on the effectiveness of storage. Weather was both ally and enemy. Droughts, floods, early frosts, and violent storms could destroy months of work in a matter of hours. Medieval farmers had no meteorology, no insurance, and limited tools to intervene. They relied on observation, folklore, and a profound understanding of seasonal patterns. Even with preparation, uncertainty remained a constant companion. The toll on the body was relentless. Hands were calloused and cracked, backs were bent, feet ached from standing on uneven ground. Exposure to the elements, combined with poor nutrition, led to chronic illness and early fatigue. Those who survived this routine demonstrated remarkable resilience. Each day reinforced the connection between labor, survival, and the physical limits of the human body. Despite these hardships, farming shaped communities. Seasonal rhythms dictated social gatherings, religious festivals, and local economies. Harvest celebrations offered moments of relief and acknowledgement for collective effort. Work, though harsh, created structure, identity, and continuity. It was not merely a means of survival, it was a defining element of medieval life. As you picture this unending cycle of labor, a question arises. If survival depended so entirely on work, skill, and endurance, how did people adapt psychologically to the constant uncertainty of nature, and how did hope persist in a world where the elements could undo everything in a single storm? The psychological weight of farming in the medieval world was heavy, though rarely spoken of in explicit terms. Each day's labor carried the silent pressure of responsibility, not only for oneself, but for an entire household. A failed harvest did not affect only the individual, it affected parents, siblings, and children. In a society without social safety nets, the stakes were immediate and personal. Survival was a collective concern, and the burden of responsibility shaped how people approached work, rest, and community. One of the ways people managed this pressure was through routine. The agricultural calendar structured every aspect of life. Spring was devoted to plowing and planting. Summer focused on tending crops and preventing damage from pests or weeds. Autumn brought the relentless rhythm of harvest, while winter offered a pause for maintenance, repair, and limited reflection. This cyclical structure created predictability in a world otherwise defined by uncertainty. Even if the harvest was threatened, at least the rhythm of tasks remained, providing psychological grounding. The tools themselves were extensions of the laborer's body and mind. A plow, scythe, or spade demanded skill and care. Maintenance of these tools was ongoing. A dull blade or a broken handle could ruin hours of effort, so people developed meticulous habits of repair and preparation. The careful attention paid to tools mirrored the care invested in the land itself. In many ways, the life of a farmer was a conversation with the environment. Every choice, from how deep to plow to how to store grain, required attention, observation, and adaptation. Community was another essential element in coping with uncertainty. Villages were networks of interdependence. Labor was often shared with neighbors, assisting each other during critical periods like sowing or harvest. Reciprocal arrangements were embedded in social custom, ensuring that everyone had access to the manpower needed when it mattered most. Beyond practical necessity, these shared tasks fostered social cohesion. People formed bonds through sweat, cooperation, and mutual reliance, and those bonds provided a measure of emotional support in an unforgiving world. Superstition and belief also helped manage anxiety. Medieval farmers often interpreted unusual weather, animal behavior, or crop patterns as signs or omens. Rituals and folk practices were employed to influence outcomes beyond their control. Prayers for rain, protective charms, or small offerings to ensure a bountiful harvest. Whether or not these practices had tangible effects, they provided a sense of agency in a world where much remained unpredictable. Belief was both spiritual and pragmatic. It organized understanding and offered hope when circumstances seemed impossible. Physical endurance and psychological resilience were inseparable. Farmers' bodies bore the brunt of labor, and the strain of constant effort cultivated patience, caution, and persistence. Pain, fatigue, and injury were understood as part of daily life. Those who endured long seasons of toil, gained a sense of mastery over routine, if not over nature itself. Knowledge accumulated through experience became as valuable as food in sustaining a household. Yet even amid these pressures, moments of respite existed. Seasonal festivals, religious observances, and informal gatherings provided brief windows of relief. Shared meals, storytelling, and communal work created spaces for humor and reflection. Though fleeting, these breaks reinforced social bonds and offered psychological nourishment that complemented physical sustenance. Laughter, song, and quiet conversation reminded people that life was larger than work alone. Children were integral to this cycle, learning resilience from an early age, observing elders, assisting in fields, and participating in seasonal tasks. They internalized patterns of behavior, patience, and endurance. The young learned that survival required vigilance and cooperation, shaping their understanding of responsibility and community. In this way, the psychological and practical education of farming extended across generations. As you consider the daily challenges of medieval farming, another question arises. If the rhythms of work and communal life shaped both body and mind, how did people imagine the future, and what hopes did they cling to in a world where every season could bring disaster or relief in equal measure? As the seasons turned and years accumulated, medieval farmers developed a quiet understanding of life's fragility and persistence. Each harvest, whether bountiful or meager, reinforced the delicate balance between human effort and the whims of nature. Survival depended on skill, endurance, and a network of family and community, but it also relied on the unpredictable generosity of sun, rain, and soil. Farmers learned that success was never permanent, and failure was never catastrophic alone. It was shared and endured. The rewards of labor, when they came, were tangible and immediate. Grain stored for winter meant warmth, food, and the ability to care for the family. A well-tended field brought satisfaction and a sense of accomplishment that extended beyond mere survival. These achievements were quiet rather than celebrated. There were no certificates or monetary bonuses. The reward was stability, the reassurance that the household could continue. In this way, farming itself became a form of meditation, a repeated, disciplined engagement with the land that offered both purpose and rhythm. The social dimension of farming was inseparable from its practical outcomes. Communities depended on each member's contribution, and participation reinforced belonging. Seasonal labor, plowing, sowing, harvesting, was often performed collectively, creating bonds through shared hardship. Weddings, religious festivals, and communal celebrations punctuated the laborious routine, reminding people that life was not entirely defined by toil. These events allowed for expression, shared memory, and the fleeting experience of joy that made survival meaningful beyond nutrition and shelter. Risk was a constant companion. Droughts, floods, storms, and pests could destroy months of work in days. Illness could incapacitate a key family member at the worst possible moment. Yet humans are remarkably adaptive, and medieval farmers learned strategies to cope. Crops were diversified, granaries built, and contingency plans considered. Risk management was not theoretical but immediate and essential. The constant awareness of vulnerability shaped practical thinking and social cooperation alike. Generations intertwined through the work of farming. Children grew up immersed in the cycles of the land, observing, imitating, and gradually assuming responsibility. Skills, knowledge, and resilience were transmitted orally and experientially, forming a continuous chain of expertise. Elders' memories of past successes and failures guided decisions, ensuring that each generation benefited from the experience of the last. This continuity created not only survival but identity, a shared understanding of what it meant to live, work, and endure in the medieval world. Psychologically, farmers developed patience and perspective. Daily labor, repeated season after season, cultivated endurance of body and mind. Pain, fatigue, and hardship were normalized, internalized as the framework within which life unfolded. Yet within these strictures, people found subtle pleasures, the taste of fresh bread, the smell of tilled earth, the quiet satisfaction of a task completed well. These moments were small but significant, shaping a sense of purpose grounded in tangible reality rather than abstract ambition. Religion and superstition remained intertwined with everyday labor. Farmers prayed for rain, performed rituals to protect crops, and interpreted unusual events as signs of divine favor or warning. Belief offered psychological relief as well as practical guidance. It framed experience, offered hope in uncertain circumstances, and provided a language through which the unpredictable world could be understood. Faith and ritual were as vital as plows and seeds in sustaining both body and spirit. Reflecting on this life, it is clear that survival, endurance, and community were inseparable. Farming was not only a profession but the organizing principle of daily existence. It demanded physical effort, mental resilience, and social cooperation. It shaped the rhythms of life from dawn to dusk, from planting to harvest, and from birth to death. In the endurance of this work, humans found continuity, identity, and the quiet satisfaction of living in harmony with necessity. And yet, a final question emerges. In a world dominated by labor and the unpredictability of nature, what allowed hope to persist, and how did people imagine a future that they could never fully control, yet felt compelled to shape with their own hands? If you were to leave the fields behind and venture into the towns and villages of the medieval world, you would encounter a very different rhythm of life. Markets and fairs were the centers of economic and social activity, drawing farmers, craftsmen, and travelers into a complex network of exchange. Life here was measured not by the plow or harvest, but by transactions, negotiation, and the flow of goods. Understanding these spaces reveals how commerce shaped daily existence far beyond what survives in history books. The market was a hub of preparation, arrival, and vigilance. Stallholders arrived early, sometimes hours before dawn, setting up their goods on rough wooden tables, carts, or blankets spread on the ground. Fresh produce, baked goods, tools, textiles, and livestock were arranged for inspection. Order was informal. Each seller relied on visibility, presentation, and reputation to attract customers. The success of a market day could determine a household's ability to survive for weeks, making preparation critical. Traveling to markets or fairs was often a challenge. Roads were rudimentary, unpaved, and frequently muddy. Travelers faced the dangers of weather, bandits, and worn animals. Yet the rewards were worth the risk. Markets were places to buy necessary goods, not available locally, to sell surplus produce, and to access news from other villages or towns. These gatherings connected otherwise isolated communities, creating a regional economy and spreading ideas, techniques, and culture. The act of exchange was as much about trust and negotiation as it was about money. Coins were scarce in many areas, so barter remained common. Grain might be traded for cloth, eggs for tools. Negotiation was a daily skill. Haggling was expected and respected. Both seller and buyer needed to judge quality, estimate value, and anticipate the behavior of others. These exchanges demanded attention, memory, and social intelligence, skills as vital as physical labor on the farm. Fairs, which occurred less frequently than weekly markets, were larger, more festive, and more chaotic. They drew merchants from distant towns, sometimes even from other countries. Exotic goods, spices, textiles, and metals appeared alongside local produce. Fairs were social events as much as economic ones. People gathered to trade, to celebrate, and to observe one another. Stories, songs, and gossip flowed as freely as coins. For a few days the world felt wider, richer, and more interconnected. The marketplace also reflected social hierarchies and power. Towns often regulated trade through charters, tolls, and laws. Certain goods were restricted, certain weights and measures enforced. Guilds emerged as organizations that controlled quality, training, and competition within specific trades. These structures ensured some stability, but also reinforced the influence of wealth and authority over ordinary participants. Merchants and craftsmen navigated both opportunity and constraint. Everyday life in markets and fairs required vigilance. Theft, deception, and fraud were risks that demanded awareness. Buyers examined goods carefully. Sellers guarded their stock, and reputation served as protection. A trustworthy merchant might attract customers for years, while a careless or dishonest one could be shunned. The flow of goods was inseparable from the flow of trust and social connection. Children, too, participated. They helped parents carry goods, collected money, or ran errands. Exposure to market life provided early lessons in calculation, observation, and social interaction. These experiences prepared them for adult roles, where negotiation and trade could complement agricultural or craft labor. Markets were classrooms as well as commercial spaces. As you picture the hustle and bustle of a medieval market, the complexity of life outside the home becomes clear. Survival in towns depended on more than food. It required skill, awareness, and the ability to navigate social and economic networks. Life here was structured by supply, demand, and human ingenuity, a different form of endurance from the physical toil of the fields. And yet, amid the exchange, movement, and negotiation, a question arises: If markets connected communities and spread goods, knowledge, and ideas, how did people manage trust and fairness in a world with little regulation and constant uncertainty? The success of a market or fair did not rest solely on the availability of goods. It depended on the subtle management of trust, reputation, and social skill. In a world without standardized oversight or reliable law enforcement, a merchant's credibility could determine survival. Buyers scrutinized the quality of products, measured weights and volumes carefully, and observed the seller's demeanor. Even the smallest deception could ruin future trade opportunities. Reputation, once earned, became a form of currency as valuable as silver or grain. Trust was built slowly and maintained meticulously. Repeat interactions mattered more than any contract. Merchants remembered buyers' habits, preferences, and habits of honesty. Buyers in turn recalled which vendors offered fair deals. A single act of dishonesty could ripple through neighboring villages, spreading warnings and discouraging future business. In this way, informal networks of reputation governed economic behavior, providing structure in an otherwise uncertain environment. Fairs, with their larger crowds and more distant merchants, complicated this system. Traders arrived from towns and regions far away, bringing goods, news, and occasionally scams. Local buyers had to judge strangers quickly, observing patterns, asking questions, and comparing prices were essential skills. Merchants, meanwhile, had to balance ambition with caution, ensuring that short-term profit did not undermine long-term credibility. The marketplace was a dynamic environment where strategy, observation, and social intelligence mattered as much as physical endurance. The economic rhythm of markets shaped daily life. Farmers, craftsmen, and artisans planned production to coincide with market schedules. A farmer would time the harvest of vegetables, fruits, or grain to sell at a fair, while a weaver might finish a batch of cloth in time to travel with it to town. Labor, production, and transport were synchronized with market opportunities, making these events central to both survival and planning. Children again played a role in this system. They carried goods, delivered messages, and learned to read both the material and social cues of the marketplace. Exposure to negotiation, currency, and measurement trained them in practical mathematics, observation, and social nuance. These lessons were invaluable, equipping the next generation to navigate economic and social life independently. Markets also provided indirect education beyond commerce. News from other towns, innovations in tools or techniques, and information about distant events spread through these gatherings. Merchants and travelers carried ideas as well as goods. Markets became vectors of knowledge, allowing rural communities to adapt to new practices and technologies, even in a world largely disconnected from formal education. The social and psychological impact of markets should not be underestimated. For townspeople and rural visitors alike, these gatherings reinforced networks of obligation and reciprocity. Shared labor and exchange fostered mutual dependence, while opportunities for observation and interaction taught social norms, hierarchy, and negotiation. Markets were classrooms, theaters, and arenas rolled into one, where survival, social standing, and community cohesion intertwined. Risk, however, remained omnipresent. Theft, accident, or conflict could erase a day's earnings. Weather could impede travel, spoil perishable goods, or deter customers entirely. Merchants had to remain vigilant, constantly assessing both the physical and social environment. The ability to adapt quickly, to recognize opportunity or danger, was as vital as any skill learned in the workshop or the field. Reflecting on this complex interplay of commerce, social structure, and survival, it becomes clear that markets were more than places of trade. They were training grounds for resilience, observation, and human connection. They shaped both the economy and the social fabric, teaching lessons that extended far beyond profit and loss. And yet, an unresolved question remains. In a world where trust and reputation determined success as much as skill and labor, how did people reconcile the constant uncertainty of trade with the need to maintain social harmony and mutual dependence? The culmination of market life was not measured in a single day's sales, but in the sustained networks of trust, knowledge, and interdependence that developed over time. Success for a merchant, farmer, or craftsman depended on consistent behavior, skillful negotiation, and the careful cultivation of relationships. The marketplace was a crucible in which social intelligence, observation, and resilience were tested daily, and those who navigated it well could secure both livelihood and status. For villagers and small-town merchants, markets were also the primary lens through which the outside world was perceived. News, fashions, and ideas traveled alongside goods. A new type of tool, a different method of weaving, or a rumor of political change might arrive on the same cart that carried grain or wool. In this way, commerce became a conduit for culture and information, shaping practices and perceptions far beyond the individual transaction. The economic lessons were inseparable from social ones. Buyers learned prudence, attention to detail, and patience. Sellers learned to anticipate demand, gauge reputation, and negotiate under pressure. Both parties developed an intuitive understanding of human behavior, who could be trusted, who was desperate, and who was willing to exploit weakness. Markets were not just about the exchange of goods, they were about the constant, subtle calibration of human relationships. Fairs and seasonal markets also provided spaces for brief respite from daily labor. The rhythmic routine of work in fields or workshops was punctuated by collective experience, songs, performances, storytelling, and shared meals. Even fleeting moments of festivity reinforced social bonds and provided psychological relief. The physical and mental endurance required for labor and trade was counterbalanced by these communal spaces, highlighting the interplay of necessity and human desire for connection. The intergenerational aspect of market life was equally important. Children accompanying parents absorbed not only practical skills but social norms, economic acumen, and the subtle strategies required for navigating negotiation and trust. By the time they reached adulthood, they were already adept at interpreting human behavior, assessing risk, and managing transactions. Markets trained both body and mind, shaping individuals capable of surviving and thriving in a complex and often uncertain world. Yet the world of trade was not without vulnerability. Bad harvests, theft, disputes, or even political unrest could wipe out profits, demonstrating the precariousness inherent in medieval life. The ability to adapt by storing surplus, diversifying products, or cultivating networks of assistance was as critical as the labor itself. Success was never guaranteed. It was earned continuously through observation, action, and negotiation. Reflecting on this, one sees that markets and fairs were more than economic centers. They were arenas for the development of resilience, foresight, and communal awareness. Life in these spaces demanded a balance of self-interest and cooperation, skill and observation, endurance and adaptability. The lessons learned here about trust, risk, and interdependence shaped both the individual and the community in profound ways. And as this story concludes, one final thought remains. If so much of medieval life relied on the delicate interplay of labor, trust, and social networks, how did these lessons of observation, patience, and negotiation ripple through generations, shaping not only survival, but the very fabric of society itself? In the medieval world, disease was not a rare occurrence. It was an omnipresent companion. From the moment of birth, individuals faced the invisible threat of infection, malnutrition, and parasites. The very air, the water, and the food could harbor dangers that modern science has only fully understood in recent centuries. Unlike today, illness was not easily treated or even fully explained. People lived with an acute awareness that sickness could strike quickly, and survival often depended on vigilance, routine, and sheer luck. Childhood was especially perilous. Infant mortality rates were high, with 1 in 3 children often failing to reach adolescence. Causes included infection, malnutrition, and poor sanitation, conditions that were inescapable for most families. When a child survived infancy, it was not a guarantee of future health. Illness could strike repeatedly, leaving lingering weakness or deformity. Parents' knowledge of remedies was limited to herbal preparations, poultices, and religious rituals. Experience guided care, but it offered no certainty. Communicable diseases spread rapidly in villages and towns. Smallpox, measles, and influenza traveled along trade routes and within crowded communities. People understood that proximity mattered, but they had no concept of germs. Isolation, when attempted, was rudimentary and often ineffective. Containment relied on observation, rumor, and community decision-making, often driven as much by fear as by understanding. Epidemics left deep scars, physically, socially, and economically. Nutrition played a central role in disease susceptibility. Diets were often monotonous, based on what could be grown or raised locally. Grain, vegetables, and small portions of meat or dairy constituted most meals. Seasonal scarcity and poor storage could lead to deficiencies, weakening the body's defenses. Malnourished individuals were more vulnerable to infections, which, in turn, reduced their capacity to work, creating a cycle that was difficult to escape. Water and sanitation were equally crucial. Rivers, wells, and streams were primary water sources, but contamination was common. Human and animal waste frequently entered the same water supply, spreading gastrointestinal illnesses. Understanding of hygiene was limited. Bathing was infrequent, and hand-washing was rarely observed. People did, however, notice patterns. Foul smells, proximity to waste, or overcrowding were linked to disease, even if the underlying mechanisms were unknown. Medical knowledge was a mix of observation, tradition, and belief. Physicians, when available, relied on the humoral theory, balancing blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatments included bloodletting, purges, and herbal remedies. Apothecaries offered herbs and potions, sometimes with real medicinal effect, often with placebo value, and occasionally with harmful consequences. Healing was as much about ritual, reassurance, and social support as it was about science. Plague, the most notorious of medieval diseases, reshaped society in ways that left lasting legacies. The Black Death of the 14th century, for example, killed millions and disrupted economies, social hierarchies, and religious life. Yet even before the famous pandemics, localized outbreaks were common. Villagers observed patterns. Certain seasons or conditions seemed to favor disease, but explanations were often moral or spiritual. Illness was interpreted as punishment, imbalance, or divine warning, influencing behavior as much as any medical treatment. Daily life was punctuated by the presence of disease. Families adjusted routines to care for the sick, bury the dead, and protect the healthy. Fear of contagion influenced social interaction. People avoided crowded spaces, fled towns during outbreaks, or relied on protective charms. Life required constant vigilance, patience, and adaptation. The unpredictability of illness shaped mental resilience as surely as physical endurance. Despite the omnipresence of disease, communities endured. Care, observation, and shared knowledge allowed people to survive repeated exposures. Children learned from parents, neighbors, and local healers, internalizing strategies for coping with illness that combined practicality, superstition, and faith. People accepted sickness as part of life and developed psychological strategies to manage the constant threat. As you consider this world, one unsettling thought remains. If disease was such an inseparable part of daily life, shaping survival, labor, and community, how did people balance fear, hope, and the drive to continue living in the face of so much invisible danger? As childhood passed and individuals matured, the constant presence of disease continued to shape daily existence. By adolescence and early adulthood, people had internalized patterns of caution, care, and observation. They knew which foods could be eaten safely, which water sources were reliable, and which behaviors, crowding, close contact with the sick, or neglect of hygiene, could invite illness. Knowledge was practical and passed down through generations, forming a kind of living medical tradition rooted in experience rather than formal education. Communities developed informal systems for managing disease. Families cared for their own, sharing remedies, prayers, and advice. Villages, when necessary, imposed restrictions on movement or interaction. Fear of contagion prompted isolation or avoidance. Though the mechanisms were crude, a household might remain largely self-contained during outbreaks, relying on stored provisions, neighbors' assistance, and faith in divine protection. These practices were never foolproof, but they reflected an adaptive understanding of risk. The humoral theory of medicine, though largely speculative by modern standards, guided both preventive and reactive measures. People sought to maintain balance among blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile through diet, exercise, and herbal remedies. Illness was seen as an imbalance to be corrected. Treatments could be physically harsh, bloodletting, purging, or topical applications, but they reflected a rational attempt to restore equilibrium based on the knowledge available. Healing was a combination of observation, experience, and faith in the unseen forces of the body. Nutrition remained a critical factor in resistance to disease. Medieval diets were seasonal and heavily reliant on cereals, legumes, vegetables, and occasionally dairy or meat. During times of abundance, people could build strength and resilience. During scarcity, vulnerability increased. Families carefully rationed resources, prioritized children's nutrition, and preserved grain and dried goods to bridge lean periods. Knowledge of storage, preparation, and timing was essential to survival. Water and sanitation practices were similarly crucial. Though constrained by environment and technology, wells, rivers, and streams were primary water sources, but contamination was constant. Households often relied on visual and olfactory cues to judge water quality. Boiling water, or using herbal infusions was sometimes employed, though not universally. Bathing was infrequent, but occasional washing, and the use of herbs for cleansing reflected both practical and symbolic efforts to maintain health. Disease also shaped social behavior and psychological resilience. Fear was ever present, but it was balanced by experience and adaptation. Families and communities developed routines for care. A sick person was attended to with vigilance, remedies were applied, and prayer or ritual provided comfort. Social cohesion reinforced survival. Those who failed to support one another faced collective danger. Illness in this sense reinforced interdependence, teaching lessons about cooperation, vigilance, and shared responsibility. Outbreaks of plague or other epidemics intensified these dynamics. During such crises, villagers witnessed mortality on a scale that seemed incomprehensible. Yet even in these extreme conditions, human ingenuity persisted. Communities organized burial practices, cared for the ill, and sought guidance from local clergy or healers. Survival depended on observation, adaptation, and an understanding that while the forces of disease were beyond human control, careful attention to behavior and routine could improve the odds. Daily life, labor, and community organization were all influenced by disease. Work in fields, workshops, or households was carefully scheduled to reduce exposure. Social interaction was moderated by caution. Festivals and gatherings persisted, but often adapted to the rhythm of outbreaks. The medieval approach to disease was not one of denial but of continuous, pragmatic negotiation with a dangerous and unpredictable environment. As you reflect on these patterns, another question emerges. In a society where disease shaped survival, work, and social interaction, how did people cultivate hope and continuity, ensuring that life, despite its fragility, persisted across generations? As individuals aged and communities endured, disease remained a constant, shaping both the body and the social fabric. Those who survived repeated bouts of illness carried the lessons of observation, care, and resilience. They understood that survival was a combination of skill, vigilance, and sometimes sheer fortune. Communities reinforced these lessons, passing them to younger generations who would continue the cycle of adaptation and endurance. Medicine, while rudimentary, played a role in shaping behavior and expectations. Physicians, apothecaries, and local healers offered guidance, remedies, and reassurance, even if their knowledge was limited. The humoral theory and herbal treatments, when combined with practical care and communal support, could sometimes mitigate the effects of illness. Faith and ritual provided psychological stability, helping people endure not only physical suffering but the emotional weight of uncertainty and loss. Daily life remained structured by risk management. Families stored food carefully, tended water sources diligently, and moderated social interactions according to health and circumstance. Labor schedules adapted to the needs of the vulnerable. The sick and elderly received support, while children learned both practical skills and the social obligations necessary to sustain the household. Survival depended on attention to the small details of everyday life, from boiling water to observing early signs of illness. Epidemics, while terrifying, revealed the capacity for collective response. Communities organized care for the sick, arranged burials for the dead, and employed rudimentary isolation practices. These strategies, though imperfect, demonstrated a remarkable adaptability. Social cohesion became a tool not only for survival, but for maintaining psychological stability. Shared experience, mutual dependence, and the rituals surrounding illness and death fostered a sense of meaning even in the face of widespread mortality. Resilience became a defining feature of medieval life. People learned to live with uncertainty, to accept vulnerability, and to prepare for sudden loss. Hope persisted not as optimism in the abstract, but as a practical commitment to continuity, tending the fields, caring for family members, and maintaining social bonds. Each small success, each recovery, reinforced the belief that life could endure, despite the ever-present threat of disease. Children, growing up in this environment, absorbed these lessons early. Observation, imitation, and participation in care routines instilled practical knowledge and emotional resilience. They learned that survival required attention, skill, and cooperation, and that hope was inseparable from action. Through these processes, communities preserved not only life but also culture, tradition, and shared understanding. Reflecting on the medieval experience of disease, one sees a world where survival was never guaranteed, yet human ingenuity and cooperation created a framework for enduring hardship. Life was fragile, yet communities adapted, learned, and continued. Sickness shaped identity, work, and social behavior, leaving an enduring imprint on society. And as this story concludes, one final thought emerges. If disease governed the rhythm of life so profoundly, how did these strategies of observation, care, and resilience influence the ways societies later approached health, science, and collective responsibility, leaving a legacy that persists into the modern world?